The legend of Old Man Wick. The town of Maple Hollow, nestled deep in the heart of New England, held a peculiar Halloween tradition. Every year, families would gather around their fireplaces and tell the chilling tale of Old Man Wick, a mysterious pumpkin farmer who disappeared a century ago. According to legend, Wick was an eccentric old man who lived alone on the outskirts of town, where he grew the largest pumpkins anyone had ever seen. Some whispered that he had struck a deal with something unholy to grow his oversized gourds, and when he disappeared, the townsfolk were sure his devilish pact had finally come due. But the strangest part of the story wasn't his disappearance. It was the warnings he had left behind. Carved pumpkins, massive and twisted, placed along the town's borders. His carved pumpkins were grotesque, too real, as if they had faces full of agony. And year after year, for decades after his disappearance, eerie pumpkins continued to appear at the edge of the town, watching from the shadows. It was just a story to most, a frightening tale that adults told children to keep them from venturing too far into the fields on Halloween night. But as the centuries passed, strange disappearances and unexplainable events became as much a part of Halloween in Maple Hollow as candy and costumes. Some said Old Man Wick was still out there, waiting in the darkness. And each Halloween, he returned to collect what was owed to him. Every year, Maple Hollow hosted a grand Halloween festival, and the centerpiece of the celebration was always the pumpkin contest. Residents would bring their biggest, most vibrant pumpkins, hoping to outdo each other for the honor of the Hollow's heaviest prize, and one lucky child would be crowned the Pumpkin Prince or Princess of the Year. This year, 15-year-old Jamie Calderwood and his little sister, Sophie, were especially excited. Their family had recently moved back to Maple Hollow after years away, and this was their first Halloween in town since they were children. Their grandmother, an old local with endless stories, had already filled their heads with tales of Old Man Wick and his terrifying pumpkins. Jamie, though skeptical, secretly hoped that something spooky would happen this Halloween. As they entered the festival grounds, the air buzzed with laughter and the sweet scent of caramel apples. Stalls lined the town square, each decorated with festive orange lights, and every vendor wore a costume. Children ran around in costumes, collecting candy, while adults admired the towering scarecrows and artfully carved pumpkins scattered around the square. "Look at those pumpkins, Jamie," Sophie squealed, pointing at a row of massive, glowing gourds arranged on the contest stage. One in particular stood out, a massive, orange beast of a pumpkin with a sinister grin carved into its face. "That one's huge," Jamie agreed, glancing at the name on the sign below it. It read, "Donated by the Wick Family Farm." Jamie's heart skipped a beat. Wick Farm? He thought it was abandoned. The Wick family had left Maple Hollow years ago, and no one in town ever talked about them anymore. "That's a prank, right?" he muttered. But Sophie was too busy staring at the pumpkin's face, which seemed to glare back at them with dark, empty eyes. As night fell, the townsfolk gathered for the traditional pumpkin lighting ceremony. One by one, the festival organizers lit candles inside each of the giant pumpkins. The crowd cheered, and children clapped as the pumpkins glowed a warm orange, their carved faces flickering in the night. But when they lit the last pumpkin, the giant one from Wick Farm, an unnatural chill swept through the square. The flame inside the pumpkin burned higher, casting long shadows over the crowd, and Jamie noticed that the air had turned cold, as if the warmth of the festival had been sucked away. Then, without warning, the pumpkin let out a loud crack, its thick shell splitting. Gasps rippled through the crowd as dark tendrils of what looked like smoke or mist seeped out of the pumpkin, curling through the air like fingers. "Jamie, I'm scared," Sophie whispered, clutching his hand tightly. "Me too," he muttered, pulling her closer. Around them, people were muttering nervously, glancing at the pumpkin and at each other. But as the mist dissipated, the crowd began to relax, convincing themselves it was just an elaborate Halloween trick. The festivities continued, but Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. That night, after the festival, Jamie lay awake in bed, his mind racing with thoughts of the pumpkin and the strange mist that had poured from it. Around midnight, just as he was finally drifting off to sleep, he heard a faint scratching noise coming from his window. He froze, his heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, like fingernails scraping against glass. Gathering his courage, Jamie crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing just beyond the window, was a figure. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. But the thing that made Jamie's blood run cold was the figure's hand. It was holding a pumpkin, small and rotten, with a face carved into it. The figure raised the pumpkin, and as the candle inside it flared to life, Jamie saw a glimpse of the figure's face. It was covered in vines and twisted roots, as if the man's skin had fused with plants and dirt. He looked like he had been buried for years, like something that had crawled up from the grave. The figure grinned, revealing a mouth full of jagged, yellow teeth. Then he whispered in a voice that was soft, yet carried through the night like a cold wind, "Harvest time." Jamie staggered back, his heart pounding as the figure's shadow melted into the night, leaving only the distant echo of his words. The next morning, Jamie was shaken, but he told himself it had to be a dream. He tried to act normal, though he noticed strange things around town. Pumpkins that hadn't been there the night before, each one carved with the same twisted face as the one the figure had held. The pumpkins seemed to appear everywhere, on porches, in yards, even inside the local diner, each grinning with that same disturbing expression. He found Sophie and their grandmother in the kitchen, the old woman sitting by the window, staring out at the fields with a haunted look in her eyes. "Did you see him, Jamie?" she asked suddenly, her voice low and trembling. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. "See who?" "The man from Wick Farm," she whispered, her eyes narrowing. "Every 50 years, he returns to Maple Hollow, and with him, he brings the harvest." Before Jamie could respond, Sophie tugged on his sleeve. "Look, a note was left for you." She handed him a small slip of paper with smudged, handwritten words. "Meet me at the edge of the cornfield. Tonight, we need to talk about the pumpkins." The note wasn't signed, but Jamie had an idea who had sent it, his best friend, Lucas, who had always loved a good ghost story. If anyone else had seen something strange, it would be him. When night fell, Jamie left the house and made his way to the edge of Maple Hollow, where the town's sprawling cornfields began. The air was thick with fog, which clung to the ground like a ghostly shroud, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He kept his flashlight low as he walked, its beam cutting through the mist, casting long shadows that made his skin prickle with unease. He found Lucas waiting at the edge of the cornfield, his face pale and tense. "Did you see him, too?" Jamie asked. Lucas nodded, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark rows of corn. "I saw him in my backyard. He was carrying a pumpkin, looked just like the one from the festival, and I think he whispered something about a harvest." The two boys exchanged uneasy glances, their fear growing. Without another word, they ventured into the cornfield, the stalks closing in around them, the air growing colder with every step. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Then, from somewhere deep in the field, they heard it, a low, rumbling voice, echoing through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the words dripping with malice. The boys froze, terror coursing through them as they looked around, but they saw nothing, just shadows and corn. Jamie's heart thundered in his chest as he clutched his flashlight, the beam trembling in his hand as he swept it over the rustling corn stalks. Lucas stayed close, his eyes wide with fear. They had both heard the voice, low and menacing, echoing through the mist and corn, but they couldn't see anything, only shadows shifting in the darkness. Then, just ahead, they spotted movement. A figure stepped out from the corn, tall and thin, shrouded in shadows. It was the same man Jamie had seen outside his window the night before. His face was obscured under the wide brim of a hat, and he held a rotten pumpkin in his gnarled hands, its carved face twisted into a grotesque grin. The man's voice, scratchy and low, floated toward them like a cold breeze. "You boys came to see the harvest. You'll see more than you bargained for." With that, he lifted the pumpkin, holding it high as the candle inside burst into flame. The flickering light illuminated his face, and Jamie and Lucas both gasped in horror. The man's skin was overrun with thick vines and twisting roots, his eyes sunken and hollow. It was as though he had been buried and left to rot, only to rise again. The pumpkin flared brighter, and Jamie felt a strange sensation pull at his mind, like he was being drawn into the fire's glow. He fought against it, snapping his gaze away, but Lucas remained transfixed, his expression slack, his eyes reflecting the flickering light. "Lucas," Jamie hissed, grabbing his friend's arm and yanking him backward. Lucas blinked, breaking free of the trance, and they stumbled back, turning to flee through the cornfield. But the rows stretched on endlessly, twisting in ways that made no sense, as if they were trapped in a maze. Behind them, the man's voice followed, slow and taunting. "Run while you can, boys. The hollow harvest always claims its due." Jamie and Lucas managed to escape the cornfield, panting as they stumbled out onto a dirt road leading back to town. They didn't speak as they walked, each lost in their own thoughts. The image of the pumpkin man burned into their minds. Jamie's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Was he connected to the legend of Old Man Wick? And what was the hollow harvest he kept talking about? They parted ways once they reached Lucas's house, but Jamie felt no relief as he continued home. The streets of Maple Hollow were quiet, and yet he sensed eyes on him from every shadow, from every darkened window. And there were pumpkins everywhere, as if they'd multiplied overnight, each one twisted and deformed, their grins impossibly wide. When he reached his own house, he found his grandmother waiting by the front door, her expression grave. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jamie nodded. "Grandma, what's happening? Who is that man?" She led him inside, her hands shaking as she closed the door. "It's the hollow harvest," she whispered, her voice low as if the walls themselves were listening. "It happens every 50 years, when the crops are ready and the veil between worlds is thin. The pumpkin man. He's part of the curse that Old Man Wick brought upon us." She pulled out an old, worn book from a drawer, flipping through its yellowed pages until she reached a faded drawing of a man surrounded by towering pumpkins, each one twisted and grotesque. Underneath the drawing were the words, "The hollow harvest comes when the night is longest, and those who see the pumpkin man may never see morning again." Jamie's blood ran cold. Is there any way to stop it? His grandmother's eyes were filled with sorrow. Legend has it that the curse can only be lifted if someone faces him on Halloween night and survives until dawn, but no one who's tried has ever returned. Halloween night arrived with an unnatural silence, an eerie calm that blanketed the town like a shroud. Every porch in Maple Hollow held a pumpkin, each one seemingly watching, waiting. Jamie could feel their eyes on him as he walked down the street, his mind racing with fear and determination. He knew what he had to do. He had to face the pumpkin man, the harbinger of the hollow harvest. Lucas met him at the town square, his face pale but resolute. He had heard similar warnings from his own parents, and now, the two friends stood together, united in their fear but ready to confront the horror that had haunted their town for generations. "Are you sure about this?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jamie nodded, though his heart pounded with terror. "If we don't, who knows what he'll do? People could disappear, like they did back when our grandparents were kids." Together, they made their way to the edge of town, where the fields began. The wind had picked up, whipping through the corn stalks and making them sway like ghostly figures in the dark. Shadows danced in the moonlight, and the only sound was the crunch of their footsteps as they ventured deeper into the fields. In the heart of the field, they found him. The pumpkin man stood tall, his shadow stretching across the rows of corn, his eyes glinting with malice. In his hand, he held a massive pumpkin, freshly carved, its face twisted into a monstrous grin. "Welcome, boys," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're just in time for the harvest." Jamie swallowed his fear and took a step forward. "Why are you doing this? Why do you torment this town?" The pumpkin man chuckled, his face stretching into a grotesque smile. "Because this town owes me. For a century, it has grown fat off my soil, reaped the rewards of my pact. But now, the debt is due, and I am here to collect." Lucas, trembling, managed to speak up. We didn't make any pact. It's not fair. Fair? The man sneered, his eyes narrowing. It was your ancestors who made the deal, boys. A harvest that would never end, prosperity beyond imagining. But all magic has a price. And now, every 50 years, I rise to take what's mine. With that, he threw the pumpkin to the ground, and it shattered, releasing a thick black mist that twisted and coiled around them. Jamie and Lucas stumbled back, coughing as the mist filled their lungs, their visions blurring as shadows stretched and danced around them. As the mist dissipated, Jamie's vision cleared, and he found himself in an entirely different place. The cornfield was gone, replaced by a dark, twisted forest, its trees warped and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground was littered with rotting pumpkins, each one with a face carved into it, all staring up at him with hollow eyes. Lucas was beside him, looking around in horror. Where are we? We're in his world now, Jamie replied, his voice shaking. We have to find a way out. They turned to run, weaving through the trees and dodging the grasping branches. But the forest seemed to go on forever, with no end in sight. And all the while, they could hear the Pumpkin Man's voice echoing around them, laughing, taunting. You can't escape, boys, he crooned. The harvest always takes its due. Just as they thought they couldn't run any farther, they stumbled into a clearing where an enormous, twisted tree loomed in the center. Its roots sprawled out like the fingers of some monstrous hand, and at its base sat a single, massive pumpkin, its face carved into a look of pure rage. Jamie recognized it immediately. It was the pumpkin from the festival, the one that had split open and released the strange mist. But now, it was pulsing with an unnatural light, and he could feel its energy radiating outward, filling the forest with darkness. We have to destroy it, Jamie whispered. It's the source of his power. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jamie grabbed a nearby rock and lifted it over his head, preparing to smash the pumpkin. But before he could strike, the Pumpkin Man appeared, his face twisted with fury. Stop, he roared, his voice echoing through the forest. You don't know what you're doing. But Jamie didn't hesitate. He brought the rock down with all his strength, shattering the pumpkin in a burst of light. The ground trembled, and the Pumpkin Man let out a scream, his body contorting and writhing as the light consumed him. The forest began to dissolve, the trees fading into mist as the darkness lifted. Jamie and Lucas felt themselves being pulled back, their surroundings blurring until they were standing once again in the cornfield, with the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The pumpkins that had lined the fields were gone, as was any trace of the Pumpkin Man. The curse of the Hollow harvest had been broken, and Maple Hollow was safe, at least for now. In the days that followed, the people of Maple Hollow awoke to a strange calm. The twisted pumpkins that had haunted the town vanished overnight, leaving only faint memories of their eerie grins. Jamie and Lucas kept their experience a secret, not daring to tell anyone what had truly happened. But as the years went on, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that the Pumpkin Man wasn't truly gone. The curse may have been broken, but legends had a way of lingering, and deep down, he knew that Maple Hollow's story was far from over. As Halloween came and went each year, Jamie and Lucas would catch each other's eye, remembering the night they faced the horror of the Hollow harvest. And somewhere, in the shadows of the fields, a faint whisper lingered in the air. The harvest always claims its due.